Okay, and we are in the final part of Extra Histories, Saladin and the Third Crusade series, A Crusade's End.
July 3rd, 1192. It's one of the darkest nights of Saladin's life. Last winter, with his forces in disarray after the defeat at Arsuf, Saladin thought he'd lose Jerusalem. But Richard's army had turned back when they were within sights of the Holy City, the English king worrying that the cold weather and his fragile supply lines would not withstand a siege. Now, Richard is back, only 12 miles away, and the Sultan knows he cannot defend Jerusalem. Days ago, his emirs had pledged loyalty to his face, but he's heard that in private, they're discussing whether to abandon him, and tensions between his Turkish and Kurdish contingents are heading towards violence. So he spends a night walking in the city, accompanied by his biographer, and he prays one more time at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tears falling onto his prayer rug. And the next morning, Saladin announces that they will abandon the Holy City.
Dang. That's a big thing to do, man. I believe, from what I've heard, the conclusion is that while Richard ensures that certain cities, get to remain certain Christian cities get to remain sort of free. Sorry, I'm looking at something right now. Ensure that they get to kind of remain still around, that he didn't take Jerusalem back. That's what I've always heard and thought, though I'm wondering if I'm wrong.
In July of 1192, it looked all but sure that Saladin would lose Jerusalem, even though he'd done all he could to keep it. After Richard and his army had turned back from their winter attack in 1191, Saladin then changed tactics. Because the Muslim army wasn't going to be able to defeat Richard on the field in a conventional stand-up battle, due to the coalition being too fragile and Saladin's men being too exhausted. So rather than outright fight the Crusaders, Saladin had decided to outlast them. Richard was operating far from home, and though he insisted that he would not return until he'd retaken Jerusalem, Saladin knew that was easier said than done. In fact, he knew that all too well. The Ayyubid Empire had deteriorated during his years managing the jihad, and compared to Richard, he was practically next door to his home territories. Plus, everyone knew Philip II of France was interested in acquiring the Lionheart's French possessions, meaning Richard was always nervously glancing back towards Europe. So in the spring of 1192, Saladin stuck it out, attacking the Crusader supply lines and using diplomacy to exploit fractures in the Crusaders' leadership. For instance, he entered in secret negotiations with Conrad, the man holding Tyre, who was in a dispute with Guy de Lusignan over the throne of Jerusalem that was such a bizarre knot of kidnapping and murder. We're actually going to do a whole postscript episode on it all next week, and it's gonna be a doozy. But for now, all you need to know is that Saladin did his best to exploit those divisions and keep Richard occupied. For the record, Richard eventually just put his nephew on the throne anyway, before making his second attempt at capturing Jerusalem. So on the eve of the attack, Richard's coalition already had some fault lines, and that was before he got the reports that his brother Prince John was secretly plotting to take over the throne of England. Yeah, he needed to wrap things up quickly and return home. Which brings us right back to where we started off. Saladin despondent, convinced he's about to lose Jerusalem. Yet that's when Richard made the mistake that doomed his second expedition. Now, we talked a lot last episode about how Richard was a better general than Saladin. But Saladin, you see, he was the better leader. After Hattin, when Saladin had to choose between seizing the strategically important Tyre or the religiously important Jerusalem, he chose Jerusalem because he knew that if he turned away from the Holy City, his troops would consider it a betrayal. But Richard, ever the good soldier, concluded that it made better military sense for this new attack to be directed toward Egypt. He would strike Saladin's most profitable province and then force the Sultan to hand over Jerusalem via negotiation. Looked great on paper. The only problem was, Richard forgot he was fighting a crusade, not a war. His announcement...
Yeah, this is just an interesting, situation. Richard is operating in, full-on, commander, military sense. The thing about holy wars, especially crusades, is that they're motivated by zeal, religious fervor. And so You know, like, yeah, he could make all the right moves and attack, Egypt and whatnot, but at the end, most people came for Jerusalem, the holy city. The religious aspect is what motivated people, not a standard secular war. And yeah, that just goes to show you, like, Richard is operating at a mindset that I think most of us here who obviously we've watched so much military exports are like, yeah, perfectly sound, like, he's got the right head, but it's like, no, he's operating in a way while Saladin realizes the religious significance of things and needs to keep it. Like, yeah, overall, I think that goes to show, the difference here. And that's an interesting downfall,
Meant that they would, for a second time, turn back from Jerusalem, fatally damaged morale. Worse, he let the army get within sight of Jerusalem before changing the target to Egypt. His war council split into factions. Both nobles and common people, who'd endured years of travel, hardship, and personal suffering in order to take Jerusalem, insisted on making the attack. Richard, believing it wasn't feasible and worrying for his reputation if they lost, threatened to resign as leader. So the Crusade fractured, its leaders unable to agree on a strategy, and withdrew to Ascalon. Saladin, seeing this, and thanking God for the return of his incredible luck, decided to strike back at Jaffa. Saladin's forces hit the city in late July, hoping to overwhelm it and strand Richard in Ascalon. They took the outer defenses quickly, but then Saladin lost control of them. His army, still furious over the massacre at Ocre, began to execute captured Christians. Horrified, Saladin managed to evacuate some of the defeated Christians into the city's citadel, which still held out before reimposing discipline. A week later, they'd nearly taken that citadel when Saladin heard shouts and turned to see ships pulling close to shore. A strike force of knights jumped into the shallows and began running in a charge, Richard at their head. Attacked from behind, the Muslim army fled, though not before Saladin tried to stage a surprise assault, but it was spotted and broken. Yet another loss, one which brought Saladin personally to the brink of collapse. Throughout his life, Saladin had always suffered bouts of illness. Years of high-stress command duties, while also running an empire, had taken their toll. But after Jaffa, his exhaustion and digestive issues became particularly severe. Richard, ironically, was also burning with fever, fighting a camp disease. And since their armies were faring no better, fatigued and falling apart, and the Third Crusade locked in a stalemate, Al-Adil went back to the Crusader camp, and the two forces entered negotiations to end the war. Once again, Al-Adil worked his magic, displaying his courtly manners and bringing excellent gifts, reminding the Crusaders of Saladin's many good deeds towards Christian women and children, highlighting the Sultan's regular gifts to the poor, and pointing out that Jews, Greek Orthodox, and Coptic Christians lived in Muslim territory without issue. In fact, under Saladin, Coptic Christians had been invited back to Jerusalem. They'd been expelled by the Crusaders. And through Al-Adil, the Western view of Saladin began to permanently shift. During previous talks, Richard had come to like Saladin, considering him honorable and chivalrous. But now increasingly, the Crusaders respected his governance and generosity, and would bring stories of this image back to Europe. Likewise, Saladin's camp took a liking to Richard, especially since the king personally cultivated relationships with Saladin's emirs in hopes of undermining the Sultan's power base. He even offered to knight some of them. After months of haggling, they finally settled on an agreement. Muslims would hold Jerusalem, but allow unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit, while the Christian states would hold the coastal land they'd taken, with the exception that Richard would return Ascalon to Saladin, but diminish its defenses. And there would be peace between Saladin and the Crusader states for 3 years. Not something either side considered a total win. In fact, both were disappointed, but not a total loss either.
Yeah, that's just a compromise. Honestly, the situation is so bad between both camps, between everyone being splintered and on breaking point, that this is just a compromise, So, yeah.
And with that, Richard got on a boat and sailed back to Europe. Saladin had indeed outlasted him. Then, Saladin made celebratory tours of forts, exercising his characteristic generosity by giving away the gifts Richard had given him. Even though he'd lost most of what he'd gained after Hattin, and had failed to destroy the Crusader states, he was still greeted in Damascus as a hero. Throngs of people came into the street, cheering for the champion of Islam. Happy he could finally turn to domestic and economic matters, Saladin talked about finally making the Hajj to Mecca. But the Sultan's closest advisors were worried. Even as he celebrated, they noticed his chronic fatigue and migraine headaches. Becoming more and more forgetful and easily tired, he declined in the next 3 months. Then, on March 4th, 1193, Saladin died, an imam sitting next to him, reading the Quran. And when his family went to pay his funeral expenses, they found in his personal treasury only 1 gold coin and 36 silver dinars. He owned no personal estates and had given all he had to the poor. In the end, his family had to borrow money to bury him.
Dang. And he was the emperor, man. Or he had an empire, but dang, dude, that just goes to show, like, he's such a likable guy, isn't he? Like, I said, so many great qualities to admire about the man. Full of integrity, honor, chivalrous, generous, great leader. Just, there's so much to like about the guy, I feel. Like, it's just hard to, like villainize him. Even the Crusaders were like, dang, this guy's kind of cool. Like, what the heck? But that's a little sad that they had to, probably deserved, like, all expenses covered, for everything he did in terms of his funeral, But still, just, like, there's a lot to love about the guy, huh? I never realized, like I said, I knew a bit about Saladin. I wasn't, like, an expert or anything before this series. I still am not, but, I always thought, like, the back and forth between him and Richard, because I've heard so much about this rivalry, was almost like they were both on the same playing field as, like, military minds. But, like, after looking at this series, yeah, Richard's definitely a military guy, but Saladin just got lucky, I feel, at certain points, Which, again, I'm not diminishing. I think luck is an important aspect for leaders, as we've seen through so many videos, but, yeah, like, I feel like it definitely changes the way I view it. Still a great leader, I'm not denying that. It's just different in the way he achieved victory than I originally thought,
Saladin's sons fought to control the Ayyubid dynasty after his death, but it was Al-Adil who would ultimately take charge. And though in the 13th century, the Ayyubid dominance would fall apart piece by piece, for a time, it fostered a peaceful environment for trade and culture in the region. But it would be the memory of Saladin, not his achievements, that would ultimately last. Remembered as a chivalrous and honorable opponent in the West, even held up as a model for European monarchs. In the Middle East, he's been cast as everything from a patriotic figure for Egyptians and Kurds to a model for Pan-Arabists and those that see themselves as battling the West. Yet neither of those images are what we see when we look at the real Saladin. We see a complicated man who could be both merciful and ruthless. An inspirational leader who managed to hold on to the greatest victory of his life by the skin of his teeth, and whose greatest strength was not as a military conqueror, but as a negotiator and coalition builder, always willing to approach enemies with respect and broker deals. A rare historical figure that in the end was respected by friends and enemies alike.
And rightfully so. That was a great series. I really loved that. I was really looking forward to this series, and I just like learning so much more about Saladin, who I've heard about, but it's cool to have a more in-depth look at the character. And yeah, overall, there's just so much to him that I really love. So yeah, there's just a lot to admire, and overall, another great series. I really have been enjoying watching a lot of extra history this year, and I can't wait for more down the line. So I'll stop here. I'll see you guys tomorrow when we start something new. Bye, everyone.